Okay, so today we are going to be talking about diffusion and osmosis. And more specifically, we're going to be talking about what they are and how they are similar and different. So the definition for diffusion is the net movement of anything from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration. And osmosis, on the other hand, is a process by which molecules of a solvent tend to pass through a semi-permeable membrane from a less concentrated solution into a more concentrated solution, thus equalizing the concentrations on each side of the membrane. Now, before we get into the logistics of what diffusion and osmosis are, I wanted to give a background of some of the terminology. So first, let's talk about semi-permeable membranes. They are a layer that only certain molecules or ions can pass through by diffusion. So right over here, this is your semi-permeable membrane. For example, water can pass through a membrane without any issues. See, these blue dots can pass through, but some things like ions or very polar charged molecules or large molecules cannot pass through the membrane. The next thing we're going to be talking about is solutions. In a solution, there's a solvent and a solute. Now, it's very important to know the difference for osmosis because they sound so similar. Well, a solute is something that is being dissolved, and a solvent is the one responsible for dissolving. So some examples could be of a solvent or of a solute could be sugar, salt, or even food dye. Now, the main solvent we're going to be talking about today in this video is the solvent water. So this is a picture of a concentrated solution and a diluted solution. Now, these purple triangles are your solutes, and all the blue circles are your solvents, or in this case, water. Now, this is concentrated, so there are a lot more solutes with the ratio to solvents. But when you add a solvent or you add water, you're going to dilute that. And so now there's still the same amount of solutes in this solution. They didn't go away. There's just more of the water to the ratio of the solute. So let's talk about diffusion. It is the movement of particles or molecules down a concentration gradient. So molecules are going to be moving from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Diffusion is a form of passive transport. Now, passive transport means that it does not require any energy or ATP to transport these molecules. And this is very different from active transport, where energy is required. Diffusion mainly occurs in gas and liquids, but it can also occur in solids. And this has to deal with because liquids and gas are able to move more frequently and randomly, but solids, while still moving, they have less room to move. This is important because this is how diffusion works. Molecules in motion that have thermal energy randomly move about, and over time, this random walk leads to a uniform distribution of different particles. So you can see in these drawings of this container, all molecules on the left don't just shift to the right and stop moving, but they actually just move back and forth freely on both sides, and eventually there becomes an even amount on both sides. And even when there is an equal amount, these molecules don't just stop moving, but they're just moving on both sides at the same rate. These molecules' motion results from collisions with each other or the container, and these collisions give them a change in direction. Now, diffusion can be changed with certain factors that change. For example, if you increase the temperature or the pressure, you will increase the rate of diffusion. So let's talk more about this. So temperature or heat is also energy, thermal energy. If you increase the temperature, you're going to be increasing the amount of energy there is in the container or of the molecules. So they will be moving more quickly. This will cause the number of collisions to increase, and there will be more change in direction, allowing for diffusion to happen more quickly. Now, diffusion happens all the time and around us daily. For example, this helium balloon. It deflates a little bit every day, and this is because helium is diffusing out of the balloon and into the air. It is moving from an area of high concentration, which is inside the balloon, to a low concentration, which is outside the balloon. It is also like, I also like to think of diffusion like a marathon. In the beginning, you have hundreds of people lined up at the start line, but over time and by the end of the marathon, people are staggered all throughout the track, similarly like diffusion works. Next, we're going to be talking about osmosis. Osmosis is the movement of a solvent particle across a membrane, semi-permeable membrane, from a diluted solution into a concentrated solution. The solvent moves in order to dilute the concentrated solution and equalize the concentrations on both sides of the membrane. Now, this can be confusing, but the main goal of osmosis is to equalize the concentrations on both sides of the membrane. So in a diluted solution, there will be less solute and more solvent. So over here, this is diluted. And in a concentrated solution, there will be more solute and less solvent. So you could say osmosis is the movement of a solvent from an area of low solute to an area of high solute. It works both ways. And this occurs naturally because the organisms seek balance or equilibrium. The benefit of osmosis is that if a solute particle cannot cross the membrane or barrier, the only way to equalize the concentration on both sides is for the solvent particle to move in. And osmosis is often referred to as the diffusion of water. Now, be careful with this because while water is most commonly the solvent in a lot of cases, it's not always the solvent. And so osmosis is actually really the movement of a solvent. And you've probably experienced osmosis just like diffusion in your everyday life. For example, have you ever tried putting a gummy bear in water and leaving it in there for a couple hours? Once you come back to it, the gummy bear is very jelly-like and more watery. And this is because of osmosis. The gummy bear lining is like the semi-permeable membrane, and the water is moving into the gummy bear to dilute the high concentration of sugar that is in the gummy bear. Now over here in the right-hand corner, there's a picture of red blood cells. On the left is a normal red blood cell, and this is what it would look like. In the middle is a hypotonic red blood cell, and on the right is a hypertonic red blood cell. Now, a normal red blood cell has an equal amount of concentration on the outside and in the inside, and therefore water is going to be moving in and out of the cell equally. In the middle, the inside of the cell has a higher concentration. So water is going to be moving into the cell to dilute that concentration, and that causes the cell to be hypotonic. And on the right, the outside has a higher concentration. So water is going to be moving out of the cell to equalize the concentration, causing the cell to be hypertonic and to shrink. This is just one real-life example of how osmosis keeps our body in homeostasis. Lastly, this is a chart comparing osmosis and diffusion. They are very similar in many ways. For example, they are both a form of passive transport. They both are trying to equalize concentrations, and they both depend on the presence of number of particles or solutes. But they are also different, as diffusion is any substance moving, while osmosis is only a solvent moving. Osmosis only occurs in liquids, while diffusion occurs in all states. Osmosis requires a semi-permeable membrane, but diffusion does not. The main difference is that diffusion does end up with equal concentrations on both sides, while osmosis normally doesn't. I hope this cleared up any confusion on osmosis or diffusion and the differences between the two.